He thought she was just another old woman slowing him down. Officer Danny Anthony, fueled by a toxic blend of a badge he'd never earned respect with, a career built on intimidation, and a contempt for anyone he'd already decided didn't matter, moved through the Callaway County Courthouse hallway the way he always did, like the corridor existed only to get out of his way. With deliberate cruelty, he stepped directly into her path, loomed over her, and told her to move. When she didn't scramble fast enough, he grabbed the walking cane resting against the bench beside her and shoved it to the floor with a sharp, ringing clatter that echoed off the marble walls. He stood over it, smiling, watching her slowly bend to retrieve it. Then he straightened his belt, let out a short, contemptuous laugh, and told her she was in the way of real business. He walked away thinking he was untouchable. He didn't know the quiet black grandmother sitting on that bench wasn't a lost visitor, a welfare claimant, or a confused senior struggling to find the right courtroom. She was the single most dangerous person in that building to a man like Danny Anthony. She was his ending. Stick around, because the moment Gloria Harper walks into that precinct conference room and takes the chair at the head of the table, what happens to Danny Anthony will leave you absolutely speechless. The air inside the Callaway County Courthouse that morning smelled of old wood polish, burnt coffee from the clerk's break room, and something heavier underneath it all, the quiet, stale weight of justice moving too slowly for too many people. Every bench along the main corridor was filled, mothers with manila folders, men in ill-fitting dress shirts checking their phones, a young woman mouthing words to herself, rehearsing something she needed to say to a judge. The building hummed with the low, anxious energy of ordinary people navigating a system that had not been designed with them in mind. Gloria Harper had been in buildings like this one her entire professional life. She knew this smell. She knew this energy. She sat with her leather portfolio open across her knees, reading without rushing, and she was completely invisible to the kind of man who only ever looked at people long enough to decide they weren't important. Danny Anthony was exactly that kind of man. Danny Anthony loved courthouses, not for the reasons a good cop might, not for the solemn weight of justice being administered, not for the sight of families finally getting answers, not for any of the things the framed quotes on the lobby walls try to make visitors feel. Danny loved courthouses because they were full of people who needed something. And people who needed something were people who could be managed. He had been with the Callaway County Police Department for 19 years. Long enough to know which clerks would push his paperwork through without questions. Long enough to know which judges appreciated a clean, uncomplicated arrest report more than they appreciated the truth. Long enough to have built a small, comfortable kingdom out of a badge, a uniform, and the absolute conviction that the law was a tool, and that the men who held the tools got to decide how they were used. His colleagues called him a throwback. Privately, the younger officers called him something else entirely. The community he was supposedly sworn to protect had a name for him too, one that got spoken in low voices in barbershops and on front porches, in the kind of careful tones people use when they're talking about weather that can turn dangerous without warning. But Danny Anthony didn't hear those conversations. He wasn't the kind of man who listened to rooms he wasn't performing in. That morning, he had come to the courthouse to sign off on a seizure report, paperwork attached to a drug arrest that had gone sideways 2 weeks earlier. The arrest itself had been questionable. The evidence chain had gaps in it that his supervisor had quietly told him to fill in. Danny had filled them in without losing a night's sleep. That was the job, as he understood it. You made the pieces fit. You kept the machine running. You didn't ask whether the machine was pointed in the right direction. He pushed through the heavy double doors of the main corridor at 12 minutes past 9, his utility belt riding low on his hip, his boots striking the marble floor with the heavy, deliberate rhythm of a man who had never once in his career felt the need to soften his footsteps for anyone. The hallway was crowded. It was always crowded by mid-morning, a long, echoing corridor lined on both sides with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious waiting. The overhead lights buzzed with a faint, institutional hum. The smell of the place hit you the moment you walked in. Floor wax laid on thick over tiles that had seen too many hard years. The burnt bitter trail of coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate since before most of these people arrived. And underneath all of it, something harder to name, a kind of accumulated human exhaustion. The scent of people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to treat them like they mattered. Danny didn't notice it. He had stopped noticing it years ago. What he noticed was that the corridor was blocked. A line spilling out of the traffic court annex had backed up along the left side of the hallway, and a cluster of people standing near the far wall had narrowed the usable walkway down to an inconvenient bottleneck. Danny had paperwork to sign, a lunch he'd already mentally committed to, and exactly zero patience for inconvenience. He moved through the crowd the way he always did, directly, without adjustment, trusting that people would read his uniform and find somewhere else to be. Most of them did, but one woman didn't. She was sitting on the second bench from the end, positioned slightly to the right of center, close enough to the main path that a man walking with Danny's particular brand of purposeful entitlement would clock her as an obstacle. She appeared to be in her late 60s, though there was something in her bearing, something precise and unhurried, that made her age feel beside the point. She was dressed in a charcoal wool blazer over a deep burgundy blouse, dark slacks with a crease so sharp it looked intentional even after however long she had been sitting. A wooden walking cane leaned against the bench at her right side. On her lap sat a leather portfolio, open, and she was reading from a dense sheaf of documents with the focused stillness of someone who was not lost, not waiting anxiously, not confused about where she was or why she was there. She was entirely, completely absorbed. Her name was Gloria Harper. She was 67 years old. She had spent the last 22 years working her way through some of the most structurally resistant law enforcement institutions in the state, and the last 4 of those years specifically preparing for what was about to happen in Callaway County. The documents open on her lap were not personal files or case notes she had brought from home. They were the internal operational audit of the Callaway County Police Department. 3 years of budget records, use of force reports, citizen complaint logs, and internal affairs outcomes that she had requested and received as part of her formal onboarding process. She was not visiting the courthouse. She was evaluating it. Danny Anthony saw a woman in his way. He didn't slow down. He didn't redirect. He moved directly toward the bench, his eyes already fixed on the clerk's office sign at the far end of the corridor, already past her in his mind before he had even reached her. "Excuse me." His tone carried none of the meaning the words were supposed to have. It was the sound of a man who was not actually asking to be excused. It was a warning dressed as courtesy. Gloria Harper looked up from her documents. Her eyes, dark, calm, and reading him with a precision he would never understand, moved from his badge to his face. She said nothing yet. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already fully assessed and filed away. Danny Anthony felt nothing. He never did with people like her. That was always his first mistake. Based on the framework, CH.2 is villain establishment. Villain's philosophy, stated in his own words, pattern of corruption shown, minimum 2 examples, corrupt system established, other officers complicit silence shown. Writing now, strictly to blueprint. Danny Anthony had not always been this way. Or at least, that was what he told himself on the rare occasions the thought surfaced. There had been a version of him, somewhere in the first 2 or 3 years on the force, who had believed in something, who had shown up to shifts with something resembling purpose. That version of Danny Anthony had been quietly suffocated over time. By a department culture that rewarded aggression over accuracy, by supervisors who measured performance in arrests rather than outcomes, and by Danny's own willingness to let it happen. What remained was this: a man who had confused longevity with authority and authority with permission. His philosophy, if you pressed him to name it, and his younger colleagues had made the mistake of pressing him exactly once, was simple. People respond to one thing. He had told rookie officer Craig Sutter 18 months ago in the break room of the 9th Precinct, stirring his coffee like he was delivering scripture. Not kindness, not procedure, not your little community outreach programs. They respond to knowing you are not the one to test. The moment they think they can push back, you've already lost the street. And once you lose the street, you lose everything. Sutter had nodded along uncomfortably and never asked Danny's opinion about anything again. The problem with Danny Anthony's philosophy was not simply that it was wrong. It was that the system around him had spent 19 years rewarding it. His arrest numbers were consistently high. The department's command structure had never asked too many questions about how those numbers were generated. There had been complaints, 14 formally filed in the last 6 years alone, logged into the citizen review database that almost nobody ever actually reviewed. Excessive force, unlawful detention, targeting, harassment. The complaints bore different names, different addresses, different circumstances. But if you lay them out in sequence, the way Gloria Harper had done 3 weeks ago on a conference table in a federal building 40 miles away, a pattern emerged that was impossible to misread. Danny Anthony had a preferred geography. A cluster of streets on the city's east side where he ran what amounted to a private enforcement operation, stopping the same people repeatedly, issuing citations that didn't hold up in court, but generated enough bureaucratic pain to function as punishment anyway, and occasionally making arrests that served no legal purpose beyond sending a message about who controlled the block. 6 months earlier, he had arrested a 58-year-old man named Curtis Reeves for obstruction after Reeves filmed Danny conducting a stop on the corner of Merchant and 14th. The charge had been dismissed inside of a week. Danny had faced no internal review. His supervisor at the time, Lieutenant Paul Greer, had looked at the incident report, looked at Danny, and said 4 words that told Danny everything he needed to know about how protected he was. Try not to repeat. That was it. That was the entire consequence. 3 months after the Reeves incident, Danny had seized the registered vehicle of a woman named Tamara Branch, citing a procedural violation so technical and obscure that the impound lot supervisor had actually called the precinct to double-check it was real. The car had been returned 11 days later. The 11 days had cost Tamara Branch her temporary job, which required a vehicle. Danny had logged the seizure as a routine enforcement action and moved on. Nobody had pushed back. Nobody had escalated it. Lieutenant Greer had annealed the report and filed it. The machine, as Danny understood it, kept running. What Danny did not know, what no one in the 9th Precinct's command structure knew yet, was that both incidents were now numbered exhibits in a federal oversight review. That Curtis Reeves had been interviewed on record. That Tamara Branch had signed a witness statement. That the 14 complaints, the impound records, the use of force logs, and Lieutenant Greer's annealed approvals were sitting inside Gloria Harper's leather portfolio at this precise moment. Right there on that bench. In that corridor. 2 feet from Danny Anthony's left shoulder. It started, as these things often did with Danny Anthony, over nothing. He had reached the bottleneck in the corridor and found his path marginally narrowed by the cluster of people near the traffic court annex. He angled left toward the row of benches, intending to cut through the open space between the last bench and the wall. It was enough room. It was more than enough room. A man walking normally, a man walking with any degree of awareness that other human beings occupied the same physical world as him, would have moved through it without incident. Danny wasn't that man. He clocked Gloria Harper on the bench the way he clocked every obstacle, with a fast, dismissive read that extracted only what was relevant to his immediate inconvenience. Old woman. Cane. Portfolio. Feet angled slightly into the path. In his calculation, this registered not as a person navigating a crowded public space with reasonable care, but as something in his way that had not yet been informed of that fact. He stopped. You need to move that. He didn't gesture. He didn't specify. He simply looked at her feet, which were tucked at a slight angle, the way anyone's feet angle when they've been sitting on a hard bench for 40 minutes, and issued the instruction the way he issued all instructions, as a fact about the world that hadn't caught up to itself yet. Gloria Harper looked up from her documents. She took in his badge number first, a habit so ingrained it was nearly involuntary, then moved her gaze up to his face with the calm, measured pace of someone who was in absolutely no hurry to be anywhere else. "My feet are well clear of the walkway, officer," she said. Her voice was even, low. The voice of a woman who had sat across tables from people far more formidable than Danny Anthony and had never once felt the need to raise it. "There is plenty of room to pass." Something shifted behind Danny's eyes. It was small and fast, a tightening, a recalibration. He was not used to calm. Panic he knew how to use. Anger he knew how to redirect. Tears he had learned to simply wait out. But calm, the particular quality of calm that didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't reframe itself as deference, that unsettled him in a way he would never have admitted and couldn't fully name. "I didn't ask for your assessment," Danny said, stepping closer. The half-step was deliberate. He used his physical size the way he used everything else, as a management tool. "I told you to move. And I explained to you," Gloria said, without shifting a single inch, "that there is nothing to move." 3 people on the bench across the corridor had stopped their own conversations. A young man in a gray hoodie, watching from the annex doorway, went very still. A woman with a stroller, who had been about to pass through the same space, quietly reversed direction and chose a different route. The hallway didn't go silent. It was too large and too full for that. But a pocket of silence opened up around the bench, the specific silence of people who recognized what was happening and had already made the private calculation that it was not safe to involve themselves. Danny looked down at her. Something in his jaw set. "People like you," he said, dropping his voice to the register he used when he wanted words to land like something physical, "always think the rules are negotiable. Always think someone's going to make an exception. Nobody's making an exception. Move. Now." Gloria Harper looked at him steadily. "I know my rights, officer, and I know where my feet are." What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Danny reached out and grabbed the walking cane leaning against the bench at her right side. He didn't fumble for it. He grabbed it with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades establishing that his hands could go wherever he decided they needed to go. He pulled it sharply away from the bench and dropped it. Not placed it, dropped it onto the floor of the corridor where it hit the marble with a hard, ringing crack that cut through every other sound in the immediate vicinity like a stone through glass. The impact sent the cane skidding 18 inches across the floor, away from the bench, away from Gloria's reach. In the same motion, almost as a continuation of the same gesture, his left forearm caught the edge of her open leather portfolio. Whether it was deliberate or incidental barely mattered. The result was the same. The portfolio spun off her lap, and the documents inside. Pages and pages of flagged, annotated, numbered exhibits from a federal oversight review, scattered across the corridor floor in a wide, chaotic sweep of white paper. A woman 3 benches down said, "Oh my God," under her breath. The young man in the gray hoodie took a single step forward, then stopped. Looked at Danny's badge. Stopped. Nobody moved. Danny looked down at the cane on the floor, then at the papers, then at Gloria Harper, whose eyes had not left his face for a single moment through all of it. Not when the cane hit the floor, not when the documents scattered, not in the ringing silence that followed. He smiled. It was a small, satisfied, deeply ugly thing. "There," he said. "Now you've got a reason to be on the floor. Pick it up. Maybe next time you'll know better than to waste a working man's time." He stepped over the scattered documents without looking at them. His boot came down on the corner of a page, an annotated use of force summary, exhibit number 7, leaving a full, clear tread mark across the text. He didn't look back. Gloria Harper did not cry. She did not call after him. She did not reach for her phone in a panic or look to the bystanders for help that was not coming. The pain in her right wrist, where the portfolio had been wrenched away, was a dull, immediate throb. She noted it the way she noted most discomfort, as information, not as an emergency. She lowered herself carefully from the bench and began collecting her documents from the floor, page by numbered page, in order without rushing. As she reached for Exhibit 7, the use of force summary with Danny Anthony's boot print pressed across the top third of the page, she paused for just a moment and looked down the corridor in the direction he had gone. He was already almost at the clerk's office, walking with that heavy, self-satisfied rhythm, completely certain the interaction was over. Gloria Harper placed Exhibit 7 back into the portfolio, smoothed the page once with the flat of her hand, and noted, for the first time, with something approaching personal rather than professional interest, that Danny Anthony's boot print had landed directly across the line that read, "Repeat offender classification, recommended for immediate supervisory review." She closed the portfolio. She picked up her cane. She sat back down on the bench and was still for exactly 30 seconds. Then she reached into the breast pocket of her blazer, removed her phone, and made a call. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Commissioner's office. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, accustomed to fielding calls that needed to move quickly. "This is Gloria Harper," she said. "Not Dr. Harper. Not Chief Harper. Just her name, spoken the way people speak names that don't require decoration to carry weight. Is Director Calloway available?" A brief pause. The kind of pause that happens when a name registers somewhere it wasn't expected. "One moment, Miss Harper. I'll put you straight through." She waited. Around her, the corridor continued its low, anxious hum. A clerk wheeled a trolley of files past the bench. Two attorneys conferred in rapid, quiet voices near the water fountain. The ordinary machinery of the building moved on, entirely indifferent to what had just happened on this bench, and entirely unaware of what was about to be set in motion because of it. "Gloria." Director Calloway's voice came through with the warmth of someone who had been expecting this call. "Just not yet. Tell me you're in town." "I'm in town," she said. "I'm actually sitting in the main corridor of the Callaway County Courthouse right now." "Good. The formal introduction at the precinct is confirmed for 2 o'clock. Command staff, union rep, the mayor's liaison. Everything's in order." "I know," Gloria said. "I need to add one item to this afternoon's agenda." A brief pause. "Of course. What do you need?" Gloria looked down at her portfolio. She thought about Exhibit 7. She thought about the tread mark pressed across the text in a clean, even line. She thought about Danny Anthony's back disappearing down the corridor, his belt creaking, his boots striking the marble with that heavy, unbothered rhythm. "I need the personnel file for an Officer Daniel Anthony. Badge number." She opened the portfolio to the first flag page, though she had already memorized the number 20 minutes ago, 4471. "I want it on the table before I walk in." She heard the soft sound of a pen moving. "Done. Anything else?" "One more thing," Gloria said. She reached down and straightened the cane against the bench beside her with a single, unhurried movement. "Make sure there's someone from Internal Affairs in the room. I'll make the call now." "Thank you, Director." She ended the call. She did not exhale dramatically. She did not allow herself even the small private satisfaction of a moment's anger finally released. She simply placed the phone back in her breast pocket, reopened her portfolio to the page she had been reading before Danny Anthony had decided she was an obstacle, and continued reading. She had 45 minutes before she needed to be anywhere. She intended to use every one of them. Danny Anthony was in the middle of a story when it happened. He was standing in the narrow break room of the 9th Precinct, paper cup of coffee in one hand, the other hand gesturing with the loose, expansive confidence of a man replaying a victory. Across from him, Officer Craig Sutter was leaning against the counter with a carefully neutral expression he had perfected over 18 months of being Danny's involuntary audience. "She just sat there," Danny was saying, shaking his head with a slow, satisfied smile, "staring at me like I was supposed to apologize. I dropped the cane, the papers went everywhere, and she still didn't move." just looked at me. He took a long sip of coffee. That's the problem. Nobody teaches them that there are consequences to... The break room door opened. Lieutenant Paul Greer stood in the doorway. His face was the color of old concrete and carried the specific, terrible stillness of a man who had just received information he did not know how to process. "Danny," Greer said. "Conference room. Now." Danny read Greer's face and felt the first faint needle of something unfamiliar. Not quite unease. Not yet. More like the atmospheric pressure drop that comes before weather turns. He set down his coffee cup and followed Greer into the corridor without another word. The conference room was fuller than Danny expected. The mayor's liaison, a man named Pritchard, sat along the left wall with a folder closed in front of him. Two people Danny didn't recognize, both in plain clothes, both with the particular stillness of people who are paid to observe, sat at the far end of the table. The union rep, Gerald Foss, was already there, and the expression on Foss's face told Danny something that Foss's carefully arranged professional neutrality was trying very hard to hide. Foss looked afraid. At the head of the table, with her leather portfolio open in front of her and her wooden cane leaning against the chair at her right side, sat Gloria Harper. She was not looking at the door when Danny walked in. She was reading. When she did look up, it was unhurried, the same measured, complete attention she had given him in the courthouse corridor 4 hours earlier. The same dark, calm eyes that had not flinched when the cane hit the floor. She looked at him the way someone looks at a file they have already finished reviewing. "Officer Anthony," Gloria said. "Please sit down." Danny Anthony stood in the doorway of his own precinct's conference room and, for the first time in 19 years, did not know what to do with his hands. "I'm Chief Harper," she said simply. "We've already met." Chief Gloria Harper let the silence in the conference room sit for exactly 4 seconds after Danny Anthony took his seat. Then she opened the portfolio. "Officer Anthony," she began, her voice carrying the same unhurried, room-filling authority it had carried in the corridor that morning. Except that here, at the head of this table, in this room, it had nowhere to dissipate. It simply landed. "I'm going to tell you what the next hour looks like. Then you're going to have an opportunity to speak with Mr. Foss privately. Those are the only 2 things on this agenda." Danny looked at Foss. Foss was studying the table. 14 formal complaints, Gloria said, turning to the first flag page. Filed between March of last year and 8 months ago. Excessive force. Unlawful detention. Targeted harassment. Each one logged. Each one reviewed by this department's Internal Affairs Office. She paused. Each one closed without action, signed off by Lieutenant Greer. She looked at Greer, who was sitting along the wall. Greer did not look back. "Lieutenant Greer," Gloria continued, "has this morning agreed to cooperate fully with the oversight review currently being conducted by the State Attorney General's office. His cooperation began approximately 90 minutes ago, when the scope of that review was explained to him in detail." Danny's jaw tightened. He turned to look at Greer. Greer's eyes stayed on the middle distance somewhere above the table. "The first domino. Curtis Reeves," Gloria said, turning a page. 58 years old. Arrested by you on obstruction charge after he filmed you conducting a stop on Merchant and 14th. Charge dismissed in 6 days. No internal review conducted. She turned another page without pausing. Tamara Branch. Vehicle seized under a procedural citation so obscure the impound supervisor called the precinct to verify it. 11 days. She lost her job. Another page. Both individuals have provided signed statements to the Attorney General's office. Both are named complainants in the federal oversight filing. She closed the portfolio. One of the 2 plain-clothed individuals at the far end of the table, a woman with a federal ID clipped to her lapel that Danny could now read clearly from where he was sitting, leaned forward slightly. "Officer Anthony," the federal investigator said, "my office has been building this review for 7 months. What happened in the courthouse corridor this morning has been added to the filing as Exhibit 31. There is body camera footage from 2 officers who were present in the hallway. There is also civilian phone footage from 3 separate individuals who have already submitted it voluntarily. Danny Anthony looked at the federal ID. He looked at Foss. He looked at Greer, who was still studying the wall. "I'd like to speak with my union rep," Danny said. "Of course," Gloria said. She gathered her portfolio and stood. "Mr. Foss." She looked at the union rep with the calm, complete attention she gave everything. "I'd encourage you to be thorough." She walked to the door. Her cane struck the floor in a clean, even rhythm. She did not look back. The federal courtroom was nothing like the Callaway County Courthouse corridor, where that hallway had smelled of floor wax and burnt coffee and accumulated human exhaustion. This room smelled of mahogany and cold air conditioning and the particular pressurized silence of a space where consequences are made permanent. The ceilings were high. The federal seal behind the judge's bench absorbed the light and gave nothing back. Every surface in the room seemed designed to remind the people inside it that what happened here could not be undone. Danny Anthony sat at the defense table in a gray suit that no longer fit the way it once had. He had lost weight in the 4 months since the conference room. His shoulders, which had carried 19 years of deliberate physical intimidation, sat differently now, lower, inward, as though the body had already begun the process of making itself smaller before the sentence was even read. His badge was gone, had been gone since the morning after the conference room, surrendered in a brief, wordless exchange with an internal affairs officer who had not made eye contact with him once during the entire process. Without it, he looked exactly like the people he had spent 19 years deciding didn't matter. In the second row of the gallery, Gloria Harper sat with her portfolio open on her lap and her cane leaning against the bench at her right side. She was taking notes. She had been taking notes since the proceedings began, the same focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything, the same posture she had held on that courthouse bench 4 months ago, while Danny Anthony decided she was an obstacle. Judge Renee Okafor looked down at Danny over the rims of her glasses with the expression of someone who had presided over many proceedings and had learned to reserve her energy for what actually required it. "Mr. Anthony," Judge Okafor began, her voice filling the room without effort. "In 19 years of service, you were given something that very few people receive. You were given authority, institutional trust, the legal weight of a badge that meant to every person you encountered that you were there to protect them." She paused. "You used that trust as a weapon, consistently, deliberately, against the people who needed it most." Danny stared at the table. "Curtis Reeves," the judge said. "Tamara Branch. 14 formally documented complainants. And 1 woman in a courthouse corridor whose cane you threw to the floor because she did not move fast enough to satisfy you." Another pause. "Longer this time. That woman is sitting in this gallery today. I'd encourage you to remember that the next time you are tempted to decide who matters and who doesn't." Danny did not look at the gallery. He couldn't. Under federal sentencing guidelines for civil rights violations committed under color of official right, Judge Okafor continued, "This court sentences you to 38 months in federal custody. Your municipal pension is hereby suspended pending full restitution review. Funds will be directed to court-ordered restitution for Curtis Reeves, Tamara Branch, and the remaining documented complainants." The gavel came down once. Clean. Final. Gloria Harper closed her portfolio. She did not smile. She did not exhale with visible relief. She simply sat for 1 moment in the ringing quiet that followed the gavel, her hand resting on the leather cover, and allowed herself exactly that, 1 moment. Then she stood, gathered her things, and walked out of the courtroom. She had a department to rebuild. 3 months after the gavel came down, Gloria Harper walked back into the Callaway County Courthouse. Not as a visitor, not as an investigator reviewing files in a leather portfolio on a hard wooden bench. She walked in the way she walked into every building she was responsible for now, with the quiet, grounded authority of someone who understood that the tone of an institution is set not by its policies on paper, but by the behavior of its people on an ordinary Tuesday morning when nobody is watching. The corridor looked the same. Same marble floors. Same overhead lights buzzing their faint institutional hum. Same long rows of wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious waiting. The smell was the same too. Floor wax, coffee, the accumulated weight of ordinary people navigating systems that had not always been built with them in mind. But something had shifted. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announced itself. It was the kind you felt first before you could name it. The people on the benches sat differently. Less braced. Less watchful. Gloria moved through the corridor at her own pace, her cane striking the floor in its clean, even rhythm, her portfolio tucked under her left arm. Ahead of her, a young officer she recognized from the department's new community liaison intake. Officer Darnell Webb, 26 years old, 3 months on the job, was moving through the same bottleneck near the traffic court annex that Danny Anthony had moved through 4 months ago. A woman was sitting on the second bench from the end. Her bag had slipped off her lap, and several of its contents had scattered across the floor around her feet. She was gathering them with the slightly flustered energy of someone managing too many things at once. Officer Webb stopped. He crouched down without being asked. He picked up a folder, a set of keys, a child's small drawing that had drifted under the bench. He handed them back one by one, unhurried, with the easy manner of someone for whom this was simply the obvious thing to do. "Take your time," he said. "No rush." The woman looked up at him with the particular expression of someone who had been bracing for something else entirely. "Thank you," she said. The words carried more weight than 2 syllables usually hold. Webb nodded once and continued down the corridor. Gloria watched him go. She stood still for a moment in the middle of the hallway, the same morning light coming through the same high windows, and felt something settle. She turned and walked toward the clerk's office to file the department's quarterly accountability report. The first one produced under her tenure. The first one in 11 years that did not require a separate internal memo explaining away its own findings. Behind her, the corridor hummed on, quieter than before, less afraid. Some institutions can be changed. Not quickly, not without cost, and never by people who mistake the permission of power for its purpose. But they can be changed by those willing to sit calmly on a hard bench, take careful notes, and refuse to move when someone who has confused a badge for a throne decides they are in the way. Gloria Harper had always known that. Danny Anthony had learned it too late. Based on the framework, direct address CTA, viewer addressed personally. Specific emotional payoff word. Szczerevel moral takewa. No more than 3 to 4 sentences. Sharp. Final. Writing now. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere right now, there's a Gloria Harper sitting quietly on a hard bench, taking notes, staying calm, and building a case that nobody sees coming. Don't scroll past. Drop a comment below and tell me, what did Danny Anthony get that he deserved most?